Good morning. My name is Maurice Crespi. I'm a managing partner of Schindler's Attorneys. Schindler's Attorneys is the co-founder of COBRA. COBRA having been founded first week of lockdown several months ago. And the idea behind COBRA was to put together a partnership amongst organizations to assist businesses in distress. And we do so through our knowledge base on our website, which you'll find at www.cobra.org.za. Through meetings, mediations, private meetings with your team, your employees, all on a shared basis, a shared value basis, or a gifted value basis. And the idea is our partners are committed to assisting in any which way possible. If required, they waive their fees. Otherwise, everything's attended to on a shared value basis, which is effectively a shared means of companies to ensure that their value is not only attributed to the company itself, but is shared amongst the businesses as required. And that's what we've been doing. And we've been doing this quite successfully. We've been able to assist over 260 businesses in distress. Businesses come through COBRA every week and they receive our assistance and they're directed to the partners who can assist. And we assist businesses from the spaza shop level up all the way up to big business. And one of the ways that we contribute to society and assist is by hosting these webinars with speakers who give us their insights, valuable insights. And today we have Sandile Zungu, who is the head of the Black Business Council, who will be talking about the role of BEE in turning the economy around. And just a bit about him. He completed his BSc of Mechanical Engineering degree at the University of Cape Town in 1988, as well as a Master's in Business Administration, MBA, at the UCT Graduate School of Business in 1995. In 2000, he completed a program for Global Leadership Certificate at the Harvard Business School in Boston, USA. So I'm going to introduce, before I hand over to Sandile, I'd like to introduce the remaining panelists. And we have Adam Craker, who is the CEO of COBRA, Peter Gordon, who is Engaged Business Turnaround and also one of the founding partners of COBRA, Emma Marseille from IQ Business, Renee Klopper from IQ Business, and of course there's me from Schindler's Attorneys. So I'm going to hand over to you, Sandile. Sandile, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this very august webinar. Truly appreciate it. I look forward to the next 45 minutes or so.
No, absolutely. So just to kick off, we'll dive into the affirmative action, but you recently said in the press the biggest bugbear is on implementation when it comes to government's plans. And you say the plans have been there, they're all over the place. To get to implementation, you need to have all the social partners aligned. Now I thought, let's just kick off with just digging into that. What are your views? Where are we from the BBC's perspective?
Well, the truth of the matter is that if you talk about plans, South Africa is always awash with plans for everything, plans to deal with corruption, plans to fight gender-based violence, plans to kickstart the economy, even plans to send the man to the moon. The biggest problem is implementation. The sad part is that that talks to what we call a capability of the state. The state has got three arms: legislative, the judiciary, and whatever else, the executive. If you look at those, there is a clear lack of capacity. When we talk about capability, we often talk about the executive aspect of the state. The truth is, even the judiciary sometimes lack capability. Hence, you see judgments being taken in lower courts being taken on review. And when the High Courts makes a determination, you can actually see that in a very subtle way, they are questioning the logic of the lower courts. And that sometimes tempts the people who are litigating to take it all the way to the Constitutional Court. Sometimes 3 years, 5 years later, the matter is only then that is resolved with great cost to those who are affected. The capability, even the legislative arm, to make laws is lacking. How often have you been told about the digital migration? The piece of legislation emerging is not providing greater clarity. We've been told about the allocation of spectrum, whether it's being auctioned or a wholesale open access network is going to be created. No one really knows what's going on. ICASA is being call it the council is appointed, and until that term of office ends, this matter has not been resolved. What does that talk to? The capability of the state. So that's where the biggest problem is about implementation. We've got great plans, but we cannot implement them. And unfortunately, the world is not waiting for us. Opportunities are flying past us. Even when it comes to the what one called the big super cycle of resources, which fueled the growth in China and the rest of the world. South Africa was able to take some advantage of it, but not full advantage, simply because we could not expand the rail capacity. We could not expand the capacity of the ports to export, and we could not even resolve the issue of what role will empowerment play in this. I'm just citing some of the examples which really affirm this posit that the biggest problem on implementation is the capability and the capacity of the state to really do what is right.
Now, just if I can jump in there, if there's a lack of capacity and you say that, you know, it's about making plans and it's all about making plans, but there's no capacity to implement, then what's the alternative? What does one do in your mind?
First of all, you've got to have the state in particular accepting that there's a big role that the private sector will play. And when the private sector says we can second people, there was a time when it was fashionable for the private sector to connive in a positive way and second highest possible executives, highest level executives to the public sector. You remember the time when the commissioner for police, I think was Mayor Khan, seconded by the private sector because crime was a major issue. It may have worked in part. It may not have worked, in whole. But the private sector has demonstrated its willingness to deploy some of its people. Of course, they get frustrated by the bureaucracy at times. Sometimes they're not correctly wired to play a role in the public sector. That's a given. But it's only when the private sector works very closely with the state that things can get resolved. Hence, for example, when we talk about kickstarting the economy, we're talking about greater focus on those infrastructure projects where the triple P model will be the order of the day. There, it's obvious because our national treasury is basically hugely handicapped. Where is money? There's no money in the fiscus. And so to be able to mobilize the resources that are required to roll out this infrastructure, whether you're talking about infrastructure for telecommunications or infrastructure for social infrastructure like housing, clinics, or you talk about roads, you need the private sector to be involved because they can then mobilize capital. So greater role from the private sector is very important to make sure that implementation happens. And there are other usual responses given, such as stop this thing of cadre deployment, because then the state gets wrong people in positions. That is, of course, true. That some people are you just wonder, what is this person doing here? Why is this person a minister? Why is this one a DG? Why is this one leading this project? Or not, because is a trusted cadre of the movement. The ANC needs to frown upon that, because it's basically doing disservice to the country. But I think holistically, greater participation by the private sector in the affairs of the state will actually ensure that implementation challenges are addressed.
Vanilla, I tend to agree, but you position it as though government are the gatekeepers in relation to the private sector jumping in. Now, I formulated a view that's something that yes, you want government to cooperate, but what about the private sector actually going alone? There are certain things that the private sector can do immediately, such as not externalizing shares in new businesses when new businesses are formed. That's the trend. Start a new business in South Africa, externalize the shares so the funds don't come in. So what are your views in the private sector actually acting solo and making a plan? Because my view is they're always looking to government, and government's always the excuse. If government's a gatekeeper and they're not able to address the issues, then surely the private sector should jump in.
Well, that's a very interesting perspective. I must be honest, I've not thought much about that. All I know is that in South Africa, even if you are a strong-willed, single-minded private sector player, somewhere along the way, the hazards of regulation, the hazards of dealing with the state come to play. Whether you are applying for a right to develop anything, whether it's golf estate or even a private hospital, somewhere along the way you'll need a license to run that hospital. Without a license, first of all, no one's going to commit to building that hospital, even if if you can mobilize the resources, but no one will commit until the license is there. So you see that one example. Whether you're applying for a golf estate, you need to have water rights. Otherwise, your grass will die. So you need to apply to water affairs to get the rights. You need to get EIAs. And sometimes they take 3 years because the law permits interest groups to stand in the way. And by the time you've gone the long way, the whole length, the investors have possibly lost interest or they've deployed their capital elsewhere. So going it alone is easy. And basically taking charge and walk roughshod over government is easier said than done. Somewhere along the way, you'll come unstuck. So my view is we've got to invest the resources as we are in just nudging government to move the right way and making sure that crises like we're having now in COVID are not gone to waste. They are used by business to impress upon government that to avoid such crises from happening in future, let's change the game. Let's change the way we work together. And let's hasten certain processes. Let's short-circuit certain regulatory impediments and so on. So that's really my immediate response to that.
I totally agree that regulation is a massive, massive problem. It's a barrier to doing business in South Africa. And I think this would be a brilliant intro into the topic for today, because a lot of political parties regard Black economic empowerment and the regulations in relation to BEE as stifling, and in fact forms part of the regulatory framework that's stifling new business from emerging. What are your views on that?
That's very interesting, because there's an article, I think, which was created by News 24. I have not read it because I'm not subscribing to News 24 as yet. But the headline is quite telling. It quotes the head of the DBSA, the chairman of DBSA, who also happens to be the chairman of the ANC's Economic Transformation Committee, Enoch Godongwana. basically refuting the DA's sentiments to that effect. That says BEE is an impediment to investment in the economy. He says there's no empirical evidence to that effect. It's basically, anti-transformation euphemism. I'm not sure where I stand on that issue. I do appreciate, because I own businesses as well, that sometimes you are unable to make progress simply because even your BE certificate is not up to date. Sometimes you lose opportunities to do business, even when you know you can do a much better job, simply because your BEE certificate is not up to date. So that talks to compliance. Maybe if you comply, you pay taxes, you get your tax clearance certificates, then you are in the game. My view is very simple. Black people were prevented from playing part in business a mere 30 years ago. And not because, they're not offered access to capital. They were prevented by law. Less than 50 years ago, Black people were prevented from becoming members of pension funds, which therefore meant they could not save for post-retirement life. And hence, the die was cast for them to become perpetual beggars. And hence you have things like black tax, where people who are working have got to look after their elderly because they've not saved, they're not allowed to save. So I'm just basically saying the need to have economic redress is very fundamental to our democratic order. And we cannot leave that to chance and hope that by frowning upon a need for economic redress based on race, it's going to wish the challenge away. The challenge is quite deep. The participation of Black people in the economy in terms of ownership is pathetic. In terms of management of the economy is equally unsatisfactory. So there's a need for using orderly and legal ways to steam this train in the right direction and to guide it in the right direction. So we must not tire of a need for economic redress. We need to tweak things to work, but to hope that we can wish away empowerment and then remain a peaceful order. I think it's wishful thinking. It's all happened. And so I serve in the Presidential BEE Advisory Council. We are responsible for tweaking the codes of good practice to make sure that they drive the right kind of behavior. It's not about just entitlement, but we deepen the entrepreneurial culture. We foster enterprises that can sustain themselves, and we focus more on companies becoming part of the supply chains of multinationals. We also want to deepen the entrepreneurial culture. Those are kind of things which, in my opinion, are responsible, a lot more responsible than basically saying dump BEE in the dustbin of history. Then what is alternative?
And I think you made it. You used the word a mere 30 years ago. Okay, democracy arose, true democracy in South Africa, and there's sentiment that 30 years is more than enough, and now equality amongst all the races and affirmative action must be done. But what I suggest is that it actually ignores case studies, and the one case study that I think should be applied constantly is have regard to America, have regard to the fact that slavery was abolished hundreds of years ago, and we still have issues. And I've highlighted those issues, and I've got a few slides because I think it's quite important for the audience to have regard to this, because it's something which keeps on propping up. Let's see if I can find it here. Sorry, I didn't. Didn't seem to show up. Here we go. So, you'll see that. Let's rather look at America's history as we have, a timeline of 170 years. Where are we today? And I've just got a few slides because I actually did a presentation on this. CNN says blacks will take hundreds of years to catch up to white wealth. This is 228 years for black families to accumulate the same amount of wealth. So these are the studies. And over here, this goes to show what's happening in America. Okay, from 1983, you can see how wealth has doubled for whites, yet stagnated for blacks. Now, do you find that there's quite a bit of resistance in relation to this 30-year notion that everything should have been wrapped up? What are your sentiments on that?
Look, I think it's very unfair. 30 years of wasting opportunities is something that we must all, criticize. There's a lot of things that have gone wrong in this economy over the last 30 years that we can justifiably be up in arms about. But the one of economic redress over 30 years is just too short a period of time, honestly. The truth is, that even the land question has not been satisfactorily resolved. People were dispossessed of their land. As recently as 1983, there are forced removals in some parts of KwaZulu-Natal Midlands. They were carried in the front page of the Natal Witness. I was doing post-matric at Hilton College in 1984. These were headline news in the daily Natal Witness, 1984, still fresh in my mind. And those people have never been given back the land. Everything must be done orderly, but to actually expect that just because of 30 years of a black president, then things have happened. I mean, clearly, for anyone who is a scholar of integrity and honesty, will know that that argument will never pass the test.
I think that's been demonstrated. That's been demonstrated just when one does a comparative analysis with other countries.
Absolutely.
Sorry, let me allow you to finish.
No, that's fine. But I'm personally, I'm always very empathetic to an argument made by people who are saying we're impatient. We would like a race to be locked out of our lexicon in a post apartheid democracy. We're all very impatient. We love to have people just see past each other's race. But the only way we can achieve that is when we single-mindedly, all of us join hand in really honoring the spirit and the letter of what Mandela bequeathed to us as a nation. He may have not had certainty about the finer details of his vision, but we know the spirit thereof is to achieve an equitable society where both black people and white people feel this country is working for them. If you saw the COVID-19 lockdown number 5 and what was happening, inequality in South Africa is deep and it's got a racial character. And it's something that we need to be very embarrassed about. And now to wish that inequality doesn't exist is wishful thinking itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I see we've got some questions here from Emma. Let's start with Emma. So, Sandile, what is your opinion? In your opinion, could be some short-term actions we can take to implement all the plans that are so often laid and left? So, yeah, I think we just dealt with the philosophy. Things have to happen now. What are your views?
Look, we need to push government. The people must join organizations that have got access to government And they must use all platforms, whether it's the media, to put the pressure. Government needs the pressure. My experiences with them in their interacting with them at Netlec, when I say I, in my capacity as president of the Black Business Council and working with Musa within the Business for South Africa, is that they are amenable to pressure and they respond to pressure. And when we tell them what needs to be done, we tell them with all frankness, and we mete out tough love to them. It's very important. They are humans as well. Left unchecked, they will slide back to their horrible ways. So, like I said, the plans are there. We need to join hands and push them, especially where they are a player, where we can go it alone, and let's just get things done. It's when people start seeing people being employed, when they start seeing us exporting goods and exporting services to other countries, that we build that momentum and we break that resistance level that is holding our country back. And before we know, we can be starting to tick things that are still outstanding that need to be done. And we must do those things with a time frame in mind. A perfect example was in 2010. We knew that the World Cup, the opening day of the World Cup was some June 10 or 11. And we knew that we had to build stadia and that to be certified as completed certain months before the kickoff date. And there was no time for wasting. There was no time for endless meetings. And we're single-mindedly focused on meeting the deadlines. And South Africa demonstrated to the world that it has the capability, it has the right kind of mindset, and it has the stakeholders under the right circumstances who can pull in the same direction. We can actually mimic the same kind of situation, even in the current situation, and accomplish so much together. It can be done.
That's such a brilliant point. I had never thought of that. I mean, we pulled together, we pulled the World Cup off, we were proud, crime went down. So we can surely do that again. No, I think that's a hell of encouraging. We have done it before, so we can do it again. I have a question here by Adam. Great to hear your views, Sandile. Business needs to push government. At the beginning of last year, Telkom and its subsidiaries were declared by then Minister of Trade and Industry, Rob Davies, as a BEE facilitator. Last month, Altron and MTN won their court case. The government is bound to follow fair and correct procedures, and it takes away the unfair competitive advantage that Telkom and BCX obtained. Would you agree this is a significant win to level the playing fields?
No, I agree. I agree, absolutely. I think the beauty about this country is that we have the rule of law. And if anything, all the stakeholders, including government itself, has tended to obey all the rulings of the courts. So it's not about the strength of political arguments. It's about what the judiciary deems to be a correct interpretation and application of the law vis-a-vis the Constitution. And to the extent that it has made significant rulings against the state, despite their very strong political arguments, is an attestation of the strength of our democracy. And certainly I support that. The playing field has got to be level. Those who are owned by the state cannot, or who have enjoyed the state protection for the longest time, cannot hope to sustain that when the private sector is also angling for a fair share of that space.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanna move to a poll, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to comment on the question on the poll, and I'll launch the poll. The question is, what do you think would be the biggest barriers to localization of manufacturing and SMME focus in South Africa? And the list we've got here for the audience is lack of consumer and retailer support for SMMEs, or inadequate skills and training for entrepreneurs, or unfavorable trade agreements or poor access to technology. So let me launch the poll, but what are your views there? Whilst we gather the votes. If everybody can vote, if the audience can please put your votes in.
Well, it's very funny because all those 4 points are relevant. For me, it would be a question of which one do I think has got a greater weighting in my own thinking. But what I've found, which is possibly lacking here, is the issue of access to capital, and the issue of access to markets, which are all equal, which are all very, very important, which I would have preferred to see in the picture here. Yes, maybe. Let's talk about access to capital. The government, as part of the COVID response, relief mechanism or stimulus package, they spoke about a 200 billion rands loan guarantee scheme. How it works is banks advance credit to their clients, and that credit is underpinned by a guarantee by the state. 200 billion rands, only 15 billion rands has been rolled out. And you ask yourself why. The excuse that we are getting from some quarters, which I'll call flimsy excuse, is no, the companies are not borrowing because they are worried that the climate is weak and they may not be able to pay back that money. It's nonsense, absolute nonsense. I've come across tens in my personal capacity of companies who basically are saying they want capital, access to capital, because they want to place orders for raw materials, and they want to have working capital. The suppliers are under stress, and therefore they cannot give them extended credit facilities. So they need the money. Am I still on the line?
You are on the line. Your video is off, so if you can turn that on. But please carry on. We can hear you perfectly.
Okay. I don't know what's happening. Okay. Yeah, I was saying that.
Yeah. So whilst you continue, I'm going to end the poll and show the results, because it's pretty much what you're saying in relation to the spread. I mean, the effective. If you have a look, it's practically a dead heat between all 4.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure if you added access to capital, access to markets, you have actually probably had those 2 polling higher than the 4 that you've cited here. Because access to capital is still a major bugbear for SMEs. Access to markets, there are many SMEs who are saying they would like to be part of supply chains of large multinationals. Multinationals have a tendency to set up their own supply chain, partners in their own college campuses. If you look at the automotive sector, for example, just to cite an example, Toyota from Japan has got partners that it works with elsewhere in the world. When they set up in prospecting, they want them to set up maybe as far away as Pinetown and not far from that, so that they can supply on a just-in-time basis. They're not interested in partnering with new entrants who are not global. Yes, they may use local players for things that are not, in their own opinion, too critical. But unfortunately, you will not grow an economy significantly enough doing trivial things in industries as important as automotive. So supply chain development and therefore access to markets is a critical issue. Government as well talks supporting SMMEs, but they don't quite do it. Because they say, look, multinationals will do it cheap. SMMEs, because their equipment in France or UK has been amortized over the years, depreciated, and so they can, undercut local competition who have just invested in heavy equipment, where they still need to make recoveries before they can compete effectively on price. So government has got to adopt a very deliberate strategy to support local SMEs, to support local manufacturers as part of its localization efforts. It won't happen just because the local players have got better technologies. No, it won't happen just because they've got advanced business knowledge. No, there are certain structural issues which are just a fact that can only be resolved if a local player like government and local big business begin to say, we'll deliberately support these guys and we'll overlook certain things which make them seemingly uncompetitive vis-a-vis their international peers.
We've got some fantastic questions coming through. One from an anonymous attendee. What sort of discussions are taking place in relation to implementing changes to effectively balance the seemingly contradictory principles of broad-based Black economic empowerment and meritocracy? Can BBBEE succeed if we do not find a way to embrace a more meritocratic approach to appointing people to critical positions of power or influence?
I think it's a very good question. Meritocracy is something that we definitely have to move single-mindedly towards. The issue of cadre deployment, because someone comes from a family with a pedigree in politics, or because someone has been a loyal cadre of the ruling party, and therefore he's placed in a position ahead of those who are most deserving, who have got the skills, who've got the experience, who've got the capability, and even who want to do the job because they feel they can make a difference, irrespective of color, whether they're Black or white. Yes, we need to abandon corrosive practices, which basically take our country backwards. But I'm afraid to say I don't agree that those corrosive tendencies are inherent in BEE necessarily. They will happen even when there's no BEE environment. If the politicians who make appointments want to overlook other considerations and subjectively say their loyal cadre is one that is most deserving because they trust that person that can toe the party line, with or without BEE, that will continue to bedevil our country. So let's separate the issues. BEE needs to be supported, it needs to be tweaked where it's got inefficiencies, and meritocracy can exist alongside BEE, but meritocracy is its biggest enemy is deployment of people who are not deserving in positions.
And isn't that's exactly what's happened? I mean, we've seen this in the Zuma years. We had the worst of the worst come in and run SOEs, and really, I mean, they were wrecking balls. I have a question here from Ian. How do BEE companies play a meaningful role in the potential rollout of the infrastructure requirements of the country? In your 2010 example, why construction companies were the fate keepers of the opportunities, and the process was fraught with collusion and corruption?
That is true. In fact, when you talk about corruption in government, and government quickly points out to the corruption in the private sector, and the 2010, the build-up towards 2010 is a perfect example, because those who were colluding, who basically, in all honesty, stole money from the taxpayer, were the private sector construction companies. But they were punished very hard. Where are they now? Government became so angry. They slowed down on the rollout of infrastructure. They were very begrudging in giving work to construction companies. Marine Roberts construction is effectively externalized. It's in Australia. Conco it's been sold to a BE player, Southern Palace. Avenge is obliterated. Its construction business has been sold as well. So the big giants of old are gone. Basil Reed is on his knees. Stephanie Stocks, similarly. Maybe the few that are Wilson Bailey Holmes is probably the last man standing. And then you've got Rubex, which are mainly focused on roads. So the truth is there's a heavy price to be paid for ill-gotten gains, especially when you have a strong counterparty like government, especially if they are begrudging towards industry. So I always say to people, let's not take shortcuts and let's stick to the nitty. South African people deserve better from those who believe they have a right to make money off their back. They can make money, lots of money, but they must do so legitimately. So really corruption and collusion has been a terrible thing in the past. BEE, the organization that I lead, the Black Business Council, once the corruption around COVID-19 became known, we were at the forefront of making noise around it. And we believe that action will have been taken against the suspects. I don't call them culprits, but suspects at our instance, because we're very vocal about it. Not the only ones, many other parties. Why? Because we don't want corruption to take root in this country. It's systemic right now. It's pervasive. It cuts across sectors, but it was not meant to be. So we can still uproot it and continue to do real business in a legitimate way.
Thanks for that. I got Peter Gordon has asked a question and I look forward to the answer. I agree with Sandile's concern on the access to capital, the low uptake of the government loan scheme. This, I believe, is because the terms imposed by government on the banks were too onerous. Is the BCC lobbying government to have the onerous conditions eased?
One specific example of the onerous condition?
Peter, you're a panelist. You want to come and jump in here?
Sandile, yes. I mean, if one considers that the recipient has to give personal guarantee, so a small company ends up giving a personal guarantee, firstly. Secondly, that the banks, unlike the loan guarantee scheme that was made available in the UK and other parts of Europe during the last recession, the government left it to the banks to decide, but didn't impose a personal suretyship requirement from the recipient of the funds, firstly, and secondly, didn't impose on the bank that if the company was in the sort of ICU unit or the less preferred lender in the bank's books, that they could still lend to them and that the banks wouldn't be held liable. Whereas what we have here is if a bank lends to a company, which it wouldn't have normally lent to that company in its normal credit terms, then it's held liable for any losses. So obviously the banks are just saying no to the majority of applicants. And then on the other side, applicants are few and far between, because if you're desperately needing capital, to start signing over personal suretyships when you're a small to medium company, I think is unacceptable.
Sure, I think that's a very good background. I'm not entirely affair with it. I think the response that I could give is as follows. Commercial banks in South Africa don't have a track record of doing business with SMMEs. And that's a fact. If you look at the quality of loans that are granted to SMMEs in this country, whether they are black SMMEs or white SMMEs, doesn't matter, from commercial banks, leaves much to be desired. For a country that is a developing economy, you will expect more credit to be extended to SMEs to get this economy running. But in South Africa, it's not so. And therefore, I will never have been surprised that when this loan guarantee scheme is rolled out, that the banks, commercial banks, will be challenged because they don't have a track record of doing business with the SMEs. And therefore, all these other issues like entrepreneurs must give personal surety may be plausible, but I suspect that it's a red herring. The fundamental issues as commercial banks have become very lazy. They prefer to give money to Eskom, to give money to Transnet, give money to Armsco. Why? Because it's underpinned by national treasury guarantees. They'll rather give money to Kumba Iron Ore, Mondi, Sapi. When one of these big players says they want to expand, the banks literally trip over each other coming to offer senior debt. Because it's easy money. And I know I'm generalizing, but I mean, it's in the spirit here that, look, we have to also put pressure on commercial banks that you've got to change your ways. This industry is very much oligopolistic. It's dominated by a few players. And unless credit is granted to the economy, this economy will not develop. I won't even bother to talk about their track record in doing business with black business. It's entirely pathetic. So my view, quite honestly, is we can nitpick and look at the specific regulations, how they actually prevent the rollout. But I think fundamentally, the banks have not grasped the need to do things differently, given the crisis that we're faced with. And hence, it's not surprising that only 7.5% has been rolled out of the original 200 billion rands.
Really, thanks for that answer. Sorry, Maurice. I do think that under the normal conditions, banks are conservative in South Africa and generally risk averse.
Yes.
However, we were faced with a crisis when we went into lockdown at the beginning of March. Government stepped forward and provided a relief mechanism, knowing full well that small to medium companies would be suffering, and then put a structure in place which I believe has restricted the disbursement of those funds. So I don't disagree with you at all. I think on the one level we have conservative banks. Of course, on the other side, thank goodness for that, because our banks will withstand this crisis. If one follows, ABSA 97% down on same time last year. First National, Standard Bank nearly 50% down on same time last year. Doubtful debt and bad debt provisioning, increasing threefold. So thank goodness that the balance sheets of the banks are robust and can withstand this. We know from our 2007 crisis that a lot of global banks failed as a result of not being robust enough. So I do think that there is a huge opportunity for the banks to work with government to manage the process of the disbursement and not, certainly eradicate the corruption that is obviously inherent if we just look at what happened in the PPE environment, but to enable the banks rather than putting conditions in place, because we're in a crisis. And if companies could have had access to that money, I posit that there would be a lot fewer companies that were closing. We just look at the restaurant business, where a huge percentage of those restaurants have closed, never to reopen.
I think I agree with you. It's a very complex matter, and of course we've got to really be proud of the registrar of banks for the oversight, but sometimes one may argue it's cold comfort for those who are basically folding their businesses simply because they're not granted extension credit. So we've got to say, the banks must become less conservative. The oversight responsibility on banks must remain strong, but not too stringent. And government must be prepared to take the requisite risk. But I mean, the truth is that we maybe for a whole host of reasons, including corruption and wastage. But the reality is that the fiscus has got no legroom and no headroom to maneuver. So if, for example, we were to grant this 200 billion rands extension without requiring security, 2 years later, the banks will say we have not been able to recoup and recollect that money. So because it's underpinned by a national treasury, write the check, Mr. Treasury. 200 billion rands has gone down the drain. So in a way, I suppose I'm also going against my own argument that prudence is required, because there are many charlatans out there who like rules to be so relaxed that they can just go in and blunder. You as a taxpayer and I will be left carrying a can. So you need to have a balance in the system. But also commercial banks need to learn to really support an environment which is in a developmental kind of economy space.
Adam Craker, the CEO of COBRA and of IQ Business, has a few questions that he'll be asking. But before I hand over to him, we have two questions, one by Louis van Hastian. Thanks for the informative discussion. Can Sandile kindly advise if black-owned measured entities also get adversely affected by one, concept of absorption, published on the 1st of the 12th, 2019, as amended to the BBE codes of good practice; two, impact of the COVID pandemic as a disruptor on the points on off and the skills development element; and three, the BBC also consider the approaching the DTIB Commissioner on COVID points and temporary relief for employers. There's quite a bit there, but if you unpack it for us, please.
My profuse apology. I for some reason the signal was just bad, and let me just see if I can I can have maybe Maurice, if you can do me a favor, just read that question again. My apology.
Okay, and whilst I read the question again, I'm going to launch another poll just to see what the views are. So please all partake in that. So let me ask the question again. Can you advise if black-owned measured entities also get adversely affected by the concept of absorption, the impact of the COVID pandemic, or the BBC also considering the DTI Commission on COVID points and temporary relief for employers? So let's just start with the third. Is the BBC considering approaching the DTIB Commission on COVID points and temporary relief for employers?
Look, I'm not entirely sure of that specific issue. I'm not entirely sure of that specific issue. I know of the TES, which obviously was administered by the UIF, and companies will have taken full advantage of that. And I know of other relief mechanisms which are targeted to specific sectors like tourism and hospitality sector. It's not much of it, but it went some way. And I know of some relief mechanisms which were targeted at SMMEs, which were administered by the DTI through its agencies like IDC and Small Enterprise Finance Agency. We've always argued that those mechanisms are not enough. So we continue to talk to the relevant powers to possibly increase the relief and but that's shifted from being a focus issue for us. We've been very much focused on this generic scheme around loan guarantee because we think it's cross-cutting. It's not limited to specific industries. So to the extent that we're agitating for that, we have said to National Treasury in this specific case that they need to maybe incorporate the non-banking financial service providers who, yes, not overseen by the Registrar of Banks, but who have tended to have much better experience, not only of doing business with SMEs, but also of providing other support mechanisms like mentorship, coaching, and assisting the entrepreneurs to get their businesses going. That those non-banking financial service providers must not be left out of the search for a solution. So yes, we continue to lobby and advocate. And when we do so, we're not advocating and lobbying just for Black business. Because we've identified a need for a very strong SME sector, Black and white, who need assistance from all those that can offer assistance. Because our belief as a Black Business Council is that for our economy to be on a sustainable growth path, the role of SMEs must not be underestimated. And it's a sum total of all those small, minute activities contributing to take our economy to a 5%, 6% path, which is solidly needed to address some of the challenges that were identified in the National Development Plan. It is through a thriving SME sector that you'll have more people being absorbed into the employment sphere. And in most cases, SMEs absorb even the less skilled. And the elasticity for employment creation is much higher among SMEs. The big companies, when they get a bigger order, sometimes they replace people with machineries. They achieve economies of scale and they want to have productivity improvements. So we are really believing that SME sector needs to be supported.
Oh, thanks for that. So, and I just want to wrap up. I'm going to get Adam Craker, CEO of IQ Business, Chief Executive of COBRA. Adam, are you still there?
Yes, Sam.
You have quite a few questions that you posted, and I see that we're almost out of time, but I think it would be worthwhile going over a bit. So if you can jump in, that would be great.
Well, many of the questions you've answered, Sandile, in particular around the emphasis, and we completely concur on the SMME front, the informal sector, the support for Black business, absolutely critical. And firstly, I'd just like to thank you very, very much on behalf of COBRA and the participants in this seminar for the perspectives you've provided to us this morning. Really, really valuable. I guess the one question I want to ask you is that, as Maurice said at the beginning of the webinar, that we've been in process as COBRA since 2 days before lockdown. And the bulk of the support that we've provided is indeed to SMMEs from the informal and formal sector all the way through to listed enterprises. What advice could you give as the Black Business Council to COBRA to ensure that we get the endorsement and the following for what we believe is a model and an approach for dealing with our economic crisis as it's unfolding? Because if I may say so, the endorsement or the advocacy has been slow. And interestingly, as a homegrown solution to the critical issues that we're facing, COBRA is being copied in Kenya, in Mauritius, and in India. And the take-up appears to be faster and more supported in those environments than in the very marketplace that we've started. Any advice you'd give us to ensure that we get that advocacy and support and that we get absolutely behind the initiative?
Well, first of all, I must express my humble appreciation of your remarks and reiterate my excitement at being invited to this COBRA webinar. I enjoyed it. And I wish you luck and I wish you success, because I think the intervention that you are making is sorely needed in this economy. South Africa is also an environment that thrives on optics, and you ignore optics at your own peril. I think the issue of diversity, I don't know how well diversified as COBRA leadership team to can at least give an impression to South Africa that you are pursuing a non-racial approach. You are sensitive to historical issues that bedevil our country from time to time. So I think diversity at the level of governance and diversity at the level of people who are part of the solution is quite critical. As a Black Business Council, we'll be only too happy to work closely with you. But sometimes as well, you need to have organizations that can almost like become your patrons, that can guide and embrace and champion your cause, so that your advocacy efforts can then be leveraged of their influence. And we will be only too happy to sit down with you to understand fully what exactly do you do and how we can assist you and how we can benefit in terms of our membership base, which we believe will solidly appreciate some of your services. So that to me is very important. But to the extent that these webinars bring thought leaders into the fold who also begin to internalize the kind of solutions and logic that you represent, it's all a step in the right direction. Bring decision makers. Many sort of training industry bring people like ITC to also participate in this, because sometimes it's through word of mouth that you make better impact than to take adverts. But also talking to the issue of longevity. If your effort started a couple of days before the lockdown, and we're talking about 30 years being a very short period of time, you can imagine how much you'll achieve in about a year's time of being in operation.
Yeah, and thanks for that. That's pretty much what Sandile. And I think with that support, which we're very, very grateful for, I think the diversity, to the extent that may be an issue, we're certainly going to have diversity. I mean, really, thank you for that. We look forward to being in partnership with you guys, and to all organizations out there. Please, if you can contribute, please contact COBRA. The idea is to assist businesses. We'd love to have you on. We are thought leaders. We'd like more thought leaders to come on, so please do. Sandile, this has been absolutely epic. Thanks so much. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to the audience for being here. And in particular, also thank you to the Facebook audience for joining us today. So thanks, Sandile. We're going to get you back, promise. And I think when we get you back, let's actually have a discussion about our joint efforts in addressing the issues, because I think our thinking is very, very much aligned. So thanks for that. Thanks, Sandile. Thanks, Adam. And thanks to the remaining panelists. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.